All right. Good morning, guys.
Morning, Perry.
Hello.
All right. Well, this is
Welcome.
a great topic. I'm glad to be here today. We talk about a little bit about manual testing and repetitive manual checks.
Yeah, this is a tough one because we do see this quite a bit in some of our clients, right? We see repetitive manual checking of software. It's the same checks that are done every time. So that's why we say repetitive.
Yeah.
And obviously we look at this and go, why aren't we automating this? What's stopping companies from automating repetitive manual checks? Because I think we all agree that these humans who are doing this work could be put to better use in terms of, well, a variety of things. What else could they be doing?
Absolutely.
I think a lot of this goes back to old traditional ways of thinking about software, where you have the developers breaking the system, finally integration and test would try to bring it back to release. They would throw it over the wall to the testers. Everyone would pressure the testers to try to make sure that the software can get out on a schedule. And when folks have moved from older traditional waterfall methods to agile, they just seem to have carried the idea of testing last along with it, and the fact that the testing has to be manual. Meanwhile, I think we're seeing that a lot of the industry has realized that, you know what, if we actually automate the majority of the testing, we can release every week. We can actually release several times a day. And you can't do that if you're still having manual testing trying to verify everything. I also learned early on when I started with XP, Extreme Programming Engineering Practices, and I got into software that way with the idea that we were going to be building out automated tests at the same time that we were building out production software. So every iteration was another increment of automated tests and production software. And so actually, by the time it came time to release, it was really just kind of we're going to push the button and push it out? Yeah, okay. Then that was what it was. It wasn't until around 2008 that I encountered my first Agile team. They were doing Scrum, and they were doing manual testing. And my first reaction was, can you do Agile if you're doing manual testing? Because I had always seen it just working like flow and working out, that things just move along. And what I started to realize looking and working with this team is the fact that the testers could possibly keep up with the stories that were in an iteration, but they couldn't go back and test things that we had done in prior iterations. And they had done their priority of the backlog, so they were working on the most valuable items first. But then you had to realize that by the time they got to release, they had not retested any of that original iteration stuff. They were only being able to keep up with the latest set of stories. So then they're in this dilemma of, do we do nothing but hardening sprints where we do nothing but testing? Or do we do this risk assessment and we decide we're going to push out with possibly things that haven't been tested in many iterations? So I've seen things like that.
Yeah, and I think when you're mentioning this, it's like, for me, I don't know when this happened, probably 4 or 5 years ago, but I changed my language. I changed my language based upon being inspired by Michael Bolton. And basically, he said that the kind of things we do in extreme programming, they tend to be checks. They're checking that something works correctly. And then we'll have hundreds, thousands of these checks running, making sure that that the software behaves correctly. He distinguishes that from the high art of testing, where, I mean, he spent his entire career, right? And he and others like Elizabeth Hendrickson and many other people, James Bach, lots of folks that heavily involved in the testing community. And I respect those folks quite a bit. I believe that even for test-driven development code bases, they'll find bugs if they bring that human element of exploring and experiencing the software and looking for stuff that may be an oddity or something that doesn't work correctly, obviously, but just getting into the software. And I've had experiences myself where I test drove something with a colleague. We thought everything was perfect. Then we go to run it and we're like, oops, you know, and that's a bit of that testing, which is just separate from the checking. So what you're talking about to me is situations where stuff ought to be checked automatically. Repetitive checks should be automated.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're wasting tremendous time. Now, why do companies tolerate this? Why do they spend years, maybe decades, in the manual checking world?
I don't know.
So I know something that I've experienced, and Mike and I have talked about this quite a bit, is that you get into a large organization and they have teams of people who are dedicated testers, and they spend many months defining these manual test suites, and sometimes there's hundreds, maybe even thousands of them. And then, like as Mike was saying, and you said as well, Josh, that when it comes time to release, they have to make a calculated assessment of the risk about what do we actually have to test in order to put this release out. What do I feel I can skip and avoid because I just don't have the time to do all these manual tests. And so I think, to answer your question, I think the reason why companies do that, I think it's habit for the most part. I think it's the way they've always done things. And Mike and I often share Grace Mary Hopper's statement that the worst words ever repeated in a company is, "This is the way we've always done it," right? And so I think it's a habit, and I think that there's a shift in skill sets maybe required to move to an an automated testing framework. But this idea that people are being stuck in this repetition of testing over and over and over again, the same functionality. When we've talked about talking about this topic, it's a poor use of that human resource. And I want to make one comment you said earlier about the high art of testing. In my experience, most developers, and Mike and I have shared this comment many times, most of us who came up as developers were optimists at heart. We believe that people will use our software as God intended, the way it was designed, right? And testers are more, they're built differently. They're more pessimistic. They ask the right kinds of questions, enabling ways to break the software. And it's that mindset that is such a critically valuable resource that is terribly underutilized when those highly skilled, testing, inquisitive, curious kinds of minds are sent basically following a written manual script over and over and over again, testing it the same way every time. So you made a great point earlier about this idea of moving them into more of an exploratory testing context, and finding ways to in order to free them up to do that, we need to find ways to give them that time. And the best way I can think of is to invest in automated testing.
And do we think the companies are afraid of automated testing? Because I mean, there are plenty of experiences, and I'll call it automated checking just to stay consistent. I know it's not easy to adopt that language, but to me, it's the difference between quickness and hurrying, right? There's testing, which is that art of really looking for problems by a human, and then there's this checking, which is equally important, right? I'm not trying to diminish it, but it's an automated thing that we do as part of our work.
I think there's also a misunderstanding about what does it mean to have automated testing. And often what they do or what they think is automated testing is basically I create a robot to do what humans do, and I drive the user interface through button clicks and scroll bars and things like that. I think that what's really important is that folks realize that you have to take a different approach to the automated testing. I use the analogy of a self-driving car. When they started working on self-driving cars, they didn't start building a robot that would sit in the driver's seat and try to drive the car the way a human would. they actually build into it sensors and other ways of being able to maneuver the vehicle in it to understand what's in its surroundings.
Right.
So the automated testing that we're talking about for software, so that you can actually get to the point where you can deliver multiple times a day, is actually more component-based testing, and it separates the business logic from the user interface, and that's usually a good design to do anyway. And so you start to realize that as you're building your system, it's uniquely built to be testable, and the automated testing kind of fits right in and gives you a security net. And it's for that reason that I also tell folks, don't have your manual testers try to create the testing code, the automated testing code. It's first off, it's not going to be what you're looking for. It's going to do that robot kind of thing. The other thing is the fact that we've even had to coach developers on how to maintain code bases. And so maintaining a code base is important, and you can end up with 2 and 3 times the amount of test code for a system as you do production code. And if that's the case, you need to make sure it's well maintained. You can't just let it become this big glob of duplication everywhere, because then you'll end up with more wasted effort on your automated tests than actually on your production code. And that's not where you want to be at all.
Yeah, there was a time we worked with Yahoo, and they had a very important thing happen where they said, we're getting rid of all of our QA folks. If you're a QA, you have a choice. Either you leave the company or you decide to become a QE, a quality engineer. And if you're going to be a quality engineer, you are going to learn how to write automated checks. And we trained them in how to do that. And that was a really huge shift there towards many more automated checks as part of their deployment pipeline. And that testers were now becoming quality engineers. Quality engineers producing automated checks, right? And learning how to do that by not just doing it the naive way of going through the user interface, or, as you mentioned, Mike, doing it in a way that was consistent with good engineering. So that was a huge shift there. It was an incredibly important shift in terms of their movement towards CI/CD and getting away from a lot of the manual testing of the past. So, and that doesn't mean they didn't start, continuing to do human-based testing of their work, right? But they were getting away from the checking in a manual fashion. They said, that's going away here at Yahoo. We can't afford it, right? We're competing with Google. We're competing with these other companies. It's just not affordable. It's so that's another thing to look at is, how much money are you spending having people in the testing role performing automated checks over and over and over again? The cost is astronomical. If you look at their salaries and you look at the amount of time they're spending doing the same job over and over and over again, which could be automated, it's a wonderful opportunity to save some money by automating that which can be automated, right? Now, again, a lot of companies, I think, have tried to automate what testers do and ran into all kinds of problems because they were approaching it in a naive way. Maybe they were using Selenium to walk through the user interface, and they had all kinds of problems because there were threading issues and asynchronous JavaScript and Selenium passing, failing. You never knew, false positives. Yes, that happens. It'll happen if you don't get proper guidance on how to produce automated checks. That's very important for your investment. But the investment should pay dividends if you do it well. That is, if you produce the automated checks in a well-engineered fashion, you'll save tons of money, right? By not having to pay people to do an automated procedure over and over and over again.
So a quick reminder for anybody who's tuned in listening, if you have any questions, we encourage you to post them in the channel so we can address them. Also, it occurred to me that we didn't introduce ourselves, so we may want to take a minute and just do that real quickly. I'll start. I'm Perry Reed. I'm a senior consultant with Industrial Logic. Been working in the Agile coaching space for about a decade or two. So that's me.
Yep, Mike Reeser. I started as an Agile coach around 2003. Learned XP and experience engineering practices, went into Scrum, and then I'm becoming more of a lean software guy since.
and Josh Karyevsky, sort of the CEO and chief bottle washer of Industrial Logic.
That's great. So we talked a little bit about the issues with manual testing. You know, it's slow, it doesn't scale, because it's human based. It's actually prone to error. But this idea of the tax on the humanity of, you know, putting a person in that position, it's kind of a mind-numbing activity. So if we wanted to transition an organization or a group of people from investing that energy in manual testing to a more automated approach, what are some other things that you would suggest they do?
I think the first thing I'd start with is shifting them left, as we say. It's like kind of bringing them upstream. One of the problems I always ran into is that testers, especially the manual testers, even during sprints for Scrum or whatever, they're always like pressured at the end of a sprint, trying to get everything tested. And as a matter of fact, I often get these questions like, what should the developers do when the testers are testing? More on that in a second. But if we can actually move the testers to the other end of this iteration, or just how we do our work, and we have them involved in the specification of what the system is supposed to be doing, now you've got a test as a specification, and now you've got something that's extremely unambiguous for developers to be building to.
Yeah.
And you know, it's a great way to build software, and you've got the folks who can actually think in terms of edge cases and broken things, that they're thinking at it from the very beginning and helping the conversation. And so, you know, I didn't want to give anyone the impression I didn't like testers. No, that's exactly wrong. Again, the idea is I'm often an optimist, and I think, well, my code works, my system is working. I liked having someone looking over my shoulder who's actually willing to say, well, let's see. Or, you know, looking for things that we haven't considered because we're so busy building the thing, we hadn't actually thought about how it might be used, or testing assumptions that we've had the entire time. There's plenty of things for testers to be doing that might actually be manual and thought work, as opposed to the repetitive tasks. And so that's going back to when, you know, I would often get the Agile coach question of, what should the developers do while the testers are testing? And my response was, have them help with the testing. And people could hear that as have them run manual tests too, but that's not the only way to help. As a matter of fact, a good developer, if you start giving them repetitive tasks to do, one of the first things they'll start doing is starting to write scripts and start writing tools and helps so that this isn't so labor intensive. And so I would really, you know, implore folks, don't send your developers on to the next feature, have them actually help in validating and verifying and doing that so that the tests will be able to run in the future and keep validating these same things. One really bad situation I ran into was this lady had asked me at a training class, because they had already been doing some Agile, but now she was in a class. She says, should I open a defect on a developer in a different iteration that I'm in? And I was having a hard time parsing that whole question. And what she was saying was, they had the developers working ahead, and they had already made it into iteration 5 in their sprints. And they were still testing in iteration 2. And not only that, but this organization didn't open defects against the software, they opened defects against the developer. And so it went against them on performance reviews. And I'm like, you know, you guys aren't even working in the same ballpark. It's like the conversations you all are having are about completely different things. But that's what will happen when folks say, let's let the developers, you know, work ahead of where the testing's at.
Yeah, that's really good.
The other thing you'll notice too, I think, is in shops that do a lot of manual, repetitive testing work, or checking, if you will, right? Manual, repetitive checking. If they're doing a ton of that, what I notice, you may notice the same, is that there's big batches of work. That is to say, there's been lots of integrations and lots of work's been put into this big giant repo, and it's not been released yet. So you have all these deltas, all these changes that have been made. And now there's a lot of work to make sure it's safe enough to put out there. Whereas in our world, when we have very fast running, very dependable suites of automated checks, we can work in small batches.
Yeah.
We can do a little bit of work and ship it, a little bit of work and ship it, whether it's publicly visible to users or not. It could be behind some feature flag, but it's live. And those automated checks support that way of working. So we've decreased the risk significantly of putting a problem into production because we're working in tiny batches. And the automated checks confirm that everything works. And then we do our manual testing, which is the art of really finding a problem. And we try to do that before we release. So we're bringing it up in our browsers or wherever we run the thing and try to mess around with it and, find problems. But only a small amount of behavior has changed that we're putting into production. So it's a lot easier to find a problem than if 15, 20, 30, 50 new features are in this giant release and we have to find out what went wrong. And we know one feature could have messed up two other features and the amount of risk just goes through the roof.
Yeah.
So this is a very natural way of de-risking
Mhm.
by working small and by having automated checks. Whereas working in big batches and doing manual checking is kind of crazy.
Oh, Josh, there's another piece that's underneath that you didn't say, but we all know, and that is that you're always shippable. Your code
Right.
base is always shippable. And so when you're working in small batches, you've gone from something which was shippable, making a very small increment, and you're still shippable.
Yep.
We went into a client site where maybe it was February or May, and we were asking them about their automated tests. And they said, oh yeah, those don't need to work yet because we're not going to release until November or December. And,
Yeah.
and so they were going to let their automated build and their automated test just sit there broken until it was time to actually get them working again. And then they were going to use it. And that's a very different mindset than what we're talking about.
Well, that reminds me of that client where they'd load up the code in their IDE and it would be broken and they'd still be working with literally with non-compiling code and they'd be working in this environment. We were like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And when we had to fix that problem before we could go any further with them.
Yep.
Often referred to as normalization of deviance. Right?
That's right. Yeah. So is it ignorance that's keeping these companies in this mode of doing, a lot of, these manual repetitive checks, or is it just fear of automating?
Well, I think it's often that they hear something is a good idea, they try to implement it, but what they don't understand is the underpinnings on it, right? I mean, that whole idea that, automated testing is a good thing or automated checking is a good thing. And so that's when they spin up Selenium, they're trying to do all of their business logic testing through the user interface at the same time that they're actually trying to exercise user interface. And so they need a guide, I think. They need help in understanding how these pieces are supposed to fit together. Because when they piece it together, they get the idea that, okay, yeah, these tests don't have to work until November. And
a comment I want to make about the point just a minute ago about the delay or the time required to do the manual testing. When you have a system of a substantial size, the time required to go through the entire suite of defined manual tests is big. So, what that means is that people will put off the cost of doing that later and later because I can't afford to go through all those tests, which is encouraging them to actually increase the batch size, right? Because I don't want to pay that big price for going through all of that manual. The full regression test is going to be big. It's going to be expensive. And so I'm going to add more and more content into my release because I don't want to pay that manual testing or that manual checking price more than once.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this circular thinking about it that just makes the problem worse and worse.
Yeah, that's right. That's a great point. Now we have a nice comment here. Our QA is very much in the mode of, I can think of scenarios after the work's deployed. I don't know how to get out of that. So very interesting statement. I guess what comes to mind for me is we've been in shifting left for decades, meaning we've invited testers to be part of elucidating the actual requirements, the scenarios. Given a user story, what is in scope or out of scope? What's the acceptance criteria for this user story? Can we think about the scenarios before we do the work for a given user story? And we invite them to do that. I started doing that in 2001 or two. And we didn't even call it BDD back then. I called it story test driven development, for lack of a better term. But that was getting them to shift up to the beginning of the creation of work. And they start to love that, because now they feel like they're creating the software, not helping to create the software, not just trying to break the software.
Right.
That I would invite that group there to try that, right? Try working, see if they'd be interested in trying to work in a way that they could help elucidate the scenarios before the work begins, by thinking through what does it need to do, you know?
And it's a great example, because what you're really talking about is a collaborative exercise between the testing community and the development community. So when they work together and they collaborate, the testers don't have to think of all the scenarios. They can collaborate with the developers as the developers are trying to understand the requirements for what it is they're trying to build. And as that begins to materialize, the question quickly becomes, well, you know, what's the happy path through this? You know, how would I expect it to work? And that usually promotes somebody with a good sense of testing skill set to say, well, what if this happens? What if I put these values in instead of the right ones? Or, you know, what about this different environmental, construct that might influence? You know, they begin to bring that to the conversation with the developers, and it's so much better to have those conversations at the beginning of the development than only to discover them at the end, when, you know, now, the software doesn't check for any of that stuff, and now I've got to loop back and implement those things that the tester knew immediately, once they understood the functionality, that these are things that are going to break that. And that's why this is so powerful, to capitalize on the knowledge and the skill set that the testers have
right
up front, instead of waiting to the end to bring those talents to bear.
Yeah, and thanks, Sadia, for asking this question. I think, you know, one thing I'd also say is, it's important for people in this profession to regularly get out of their comfort zone if they're going to improve. So for testers who are used to like working out scenarios after the code's been deployed or after the code's been created, get out of your comfort zone, try some experiments, see what this is like to be part of elucidating the acceptance criteria before the work begins. As an experiment, try it for a month, try it for a couple of months, see what that's like. You might actually love it, but get out of your comfort zone, because that's no place to be, to stay. You're never going to be that great if you just stay there.
Yeah. One of the thought I think would be good to share is the idea of giving advice to a team that wants to transition from, a heavily manual check mindset to a more automated check mindset. And we talked about, shifting left, getting them collaborating with the developers. And I think that's a huge step forward. But when you're looking at, what is maybe hundreds, if not thousands of manual checks, and you want to move them all to an automated context, it can be overwhelming and very daunting to say, well, what are we going to do? We're going to stop everything and convert all 100, 500, 600 of these checks into automated testing. It's unrealistic that anybody will give a team the time and energy to go do that in one big chunk. So a technique that Mike and I have used many times with other clients that we've worked with is that the team comes up with a new set of agreements. And as a team, the team begins to agree to say that every time we have new functionality, new code that we're going to write, that new code will come with new tests around that code, new automated tests. And if we have a change request that comes in and we have to go modify existing code that maybe is only being tested manually, our new agreement would say that those changes to that existing code will come with automated test around those changes. So you begin to draw a line in the sand and say, this point forward, anything that's new or anything that's changed, we'll make the investment to automate that. And systematically, as more and more code gets changed, that existing body of manual tests will get replaced with automated tests. And probably because if you do it that way, the more frequently used or exercised code is likely to be in that stuff that's getting changed more often than not. Eventually, the more critical parts of the system will get covered.
Well said. Yes. You know, I've been in environments where there were a lot of testers doing things manually, and you know, one particular group, they had a tool which they'd spent $100,000 on called, I think it was called Test Partner. It was terrible, but they'd already been trained on it. They already bought it, and so we said, great, let's use it. And it was the kind of thing that if you ran it on a monitor, one particular monitor of a certain size, it would run. But if you ran it on a bigger monitor, it would fail. It was literally like so fragile beyond belief. However, they'd already spent the money. They'd been trained on it. So we built about, I think it was about 40 automated checks with that tool, which provided some oversight and some sort of safety net to allow us to go deeper into this old C++ code base. And those 40 automated checks, you know, ended up being very useful for us to see that the major functionality worked, right? It wasn't fine-grained testing. We did that later, but it was enough to give us a safety net. That I think that's often a way to get started. And of course, we wanted to get rid of those tests, those checks, because they were awful in terms of only being able to run, you know, in a given computer type setup. But you know, you use what you got to at least get some safety in place as quickly as you can before you can begin making some deeper changes. You know, we expect a lot from our code. We architect it in such a way that we can do a lot of automated checks very easily. But a lot of code's spaghetti code. It's intertwined. It's, you know, the business logic intertwined with the user interface, or the back end code is very tightly coupled. It's not so easy to separate out the domain logic, whereas we almost take that for granted around here. So there's a lot of work often to do to just redesign or re-architect the code just to make it more amenable to automated checking.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Well, we're getting close to the end. Anything you guys want to say to kind of sum up where this conversation is taking us?
Well, the thing to me is computers do repetitive tasks well. And I think that you ought to let the computers do the repetitive tasks and free up your developers to be able to do the creative work, the thought work, the looking for value work. I mean, I've had testers who said, this feature doesn't make any sense to me. And I said, I know I coded it, but yeah, it didn't make any sense to me. It would be nice if someone would voice that for the customer and say, look, maybe this doesn't make sense. So looking for value is something that I think we should all be doing, that the testers can also be looking at that because they know how to run the software very well.
Yeah. Yeah, I would add that, you know, leaving things alone, the status quo of continuing to use manual checks for everything you do, there's a cost associated with that. And leaving things alone may feel safe and may feel comfortable, and maybe there's reasons why you think that may be the right approach. But realizing that continuing to do that is inhibiting the team in advancing. And if you ever want to get to continuous deployment, continuous delivery, manual checks are never going to get you there. So you have to really think about that in the big scheme of things.
And I would just conclude that, you know, testers are meant to be doing the art of testing, not this trivial manual checking stuff. Their profession is meant to be exploring, experiencing the software, looking for the anomalies, looking for the things that the developers didn't think of, and, you know, squashing those bugs before they make it to production. That is a high art. It's a practice that one can get quite skilled at. And spending all those hours in automated checking is really not a great use of their time. It's expensive. It doesn't lower risk easily. It leads to large batches of big releases. It's just bad in all respects. So by all means, I think companies need to start investing in the process of automating these checks. And TDD, test-driven development, is one of the practices we use quite a bit to make that almost you know, something we don't even have to think about. The production of the automated checks is a byproduct of doing test-driven development.
Mhm.
We similarly for BDD, behavior-driven development, and in general, we refer to these things as example-guided work, right? You're guiding your work through examples, and those examples become automated checks. So, yeah, it's if you're still doing this manual repetitive checking, it's time to wake up and join the crew of people that have now moved towards a far better, you know, approach.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you guys very much.
All right.
Thanks for watching.